When I was little, I was playing baseball, and if you know me, you know that I'm a competitive person. I like to compete as much as anybody and with anything. We don't play board games in our house, probably because of me, because it doesn't usually go very well. But when I was in coach pitch, I don't know if you call it T-ball or what it was at that point, but coach pitch at this time, I was in the middle of a game, and I specifically remember this because my parents never let me forget this memory. I was really mad because the coach threw me the first two pitches, and I swung, and I missed both of them. And I was pretty mad, got really angry at that because I knew I could hit off the coach, and I wanted to be able to hit off the coach because I didn't want to hit off the tee because that's what the kids that don't know how to play do. They hit off the tee, right? And so I didn't want to hit off the tee, but they made me because that was the rules. I had to hit off the tee. And so I'm mad about that, and I hit off the tee. I get thrown out at first, and my anger just took over me at that moment. I took my helmet off, and I threw it on the ground. And I kicked my helmet from first base all the way to the third base dugout because I was so mad at this play. And the reason I never forget that moment, some of y'all are really judging me right now, and I don't like it, all right? But the reason I don't forget that moment is my dad was not even my coach at the time, came out of the stands, and the coach tried to stop him, and he said, "Stop, coach." And so he just came on the field, and he made me kick my helmet all the way back to first base, and then pick it up, put it on, and then hustle back to third base dugout. Anybody ever had a situation like that at the ball fields? That's good parenting, right? Because I had this bad attitude, and I never forget it. My dad still has it. If you want to see it, it's on VHS if you happen to have a VCR still at your house. Anger is something that I personally have always struggled with from a young age. My go-to reaction when something doesn't go my way has been anger. I don't like things that I can't control. Lindsay laughs at me every time we fly somewhere because I don't get anxious about much, but I get anxious about flying. We were flying into New York one time, and if you've ever flown in New York, there's a lot of crosswinds. And I remember flying in, you're looking at all this giant city, and the plane's like flying sideways. And I'm holding onto the seats like, just so mad because I can't control what the plane is doing. Like if I'm going to die, I want to be in control of that, right? And so there's just something about when I'm not in control, anger is my go-to expression of that. And so naturally today, I'm preaching on anger. And I give you this disclaimer because one of the things that we try to do around here at Collective is practice courageous transparency, one of our core values. I don't get on this stage today and proclaim to you that I've got this act mastered. I'm far from that. I'm not going to get up on a stage and portray something that I am not. And so today I am preaching to myself in many ways. And I don't know what it is about parents and grandparents, but if you're a grandparent, you know this now. But typically when the grandchild throws a fit, you know what the grandparents do? They laugh because it's payback, right? You know that? There's that laugh, like when grandchildren throw a fit with their parents or they have a bad attitude, the grandparents just sit off to the side and they're like, that's what you get. Because you start to see, like, generationally, there's things that kind of come back to you. And even so, anytime I'm with my parents, my dad just sits there and he just laughs. I'm like, this does not make me happy right now. And so as we talk about anger today, I'm in process with you. I want to give that disclaimer to you. I don't have this figured out. It's something that I'm wrestling with, and I struggle with, and I have to watch myself. And so anger, to me, is something that we all deal with. We may not express it in the same way as other people do, but if somebody was to tell you, I don't struggle with anger, I don't have anger, I would probably tell you that person is not telling the truth. Because for all of us in the room, we all have that. We all have an expression of anger. It looks different than other people maybe. Maybe somebody gets angry and they, like I grew up in a house of boys, and every once in a while there would be a fist hole in the wall of the drywall. That was not the case for Lindsay's house, right? Who grew up in an all-girls home. Like there's things like that you know and you see in our world that we express things differently. Thankfully, I'm not the one that punched the drywall, so please stop judging me, all right? But if somebody says that they don't struggle with anger, what I would encourage that person to do is with their spouse, if they could buy a new child's car seat and install it in their car, and we'll see if they have anger or not. Have you ever done that? It works for me every time. Every time we get a new car seat, I'm like, I watch all the YouTube videos and it just doesn't work. It's impossible to figure out. If you're new with us, we've been, or haven't been in a while, we're in the middle of a series called The Way of Jesus. And we're studying the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, as Jesus stands on this hillside in Galilee and he's proclaiming this new kingdom, this new way to live for the Jews and now the Gentiles, as he's opening up, he's proclaiming these things, and we are looking at it and saying, does our life look like the way that Jesus intended this Christian life to be? We hold it up as a mirror to ourselves, not to degrade ourselves and not to say, look, I'm not good enough, but to say that if Jesus calls us to do something, then we should be doing that very thing. And so we want to look at this idea of the Sermon on the Mount as a mirror for ourselves. Are we doing the things that Jesus has called us to do? And so as we've walked through the Beatitudes and now we're working our way through the rest of the sermon, I think it's important for us to see the connections between the Beatitudes and the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. And you'll see some of that today as we spent quite a bit of time working through the Beatitudes. And so pay attention to how they interact together. Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to start in verse 21 through 26. This is what Jesus says. You have heard it said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there and at the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going to him, while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and to be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Now, this passage of scripture, there's a lot happening here. And more than likely, we could spend a few weeks just on this one passage. But for the sake of time, we're going to lump it all in together for one. But the goal for us today is to kind of make it more digestible in this idea of what Jesus is saying here. And so here's the main idea if you're taking notes. Is that Jesus directs us to live with inward composure and outward peace. Jesus directs us to live with inward composure and outward peace. Inward composure meaning that we are called to control our anger, which we're going to talk about here today. And then outward peace meaning to live peaceable with others. Excuse me. And so Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. Let's look at verses 21 through 22 again. It says, you have heard it said to those of old that you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the lake of fire or hell. At the beginning of this passage, we see this new phrase that is introduced in the Gospel of Matthew where it says, you have heard it said. This is a phrase that's going to be repeated 6 times over the next few passages, over the next 6 passages. He starts these passages off through the end of Matthew chapter 5. What's important to know is that Jesus is not doing away with the law, as we talked about extensively last week, that he did not come to abolish or to get rid of or to replace the law, that he came to fulfill the law. And so as Jesus is saying that, we're remembering that he's saying, I didn't come to abolish or to replace the law, but to fulfill it. He's saying that all throughout this passage, we have this new phrase that you have heard it said. And what he's saying is rather than replacing, he's saying, I want you to get to the heart of the law. I want you to dive down and see the heart behind the reason that you have this law that I have given you, that God has given you. And so some have called these the antitheses, but they aren't anti, these 6 antitheses. They would say, if it was that, if they were anti, it would say, you have said not to murder, or you have heard it said not to murder, but you should murder. That's not what Jesus is saying, right? He's not saying the opposite, but he's saying, you have heard it said not to murder, but I've said, do not even be angry with your brother. What we see Jesus is that he is intensifying or deepening the intent of the law here. He's taking it a step further as he ushers in this new kingdom, this new way of living. And then Jesus gives this commandment from the law, back all the way back to the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. You have heard it said, thou shalt not murder. Now, for us in the room, I think we could all agree that that commandment is one that all of us would agree with, right? There's nobody in this world that would say, like, I don't like that one. Most people in this room would say, yes, I agree. For instance, even in our world, people that aren't Christ followers, people that aren't, there may be agnostic or atheists, people agree that most of the 10 Commandments are a good idea for society. According to Nationscape, 65% of Americans across all political views support the 10 Commandments being placed in schools and in courtrooms across our country. And so as you see these laws that Jesus is referencing back to the Old Testament, we would say, like, yeah, that's a good thing. Like, thou shalt not murder. Like, I think that's a good law to have. Seems pretty easy to avoid, but Jesus pushes deeper into the issue, because the reality is that we have a tendency, all of us, to dismiss laws and commands that we may not struggle with. For us, like most of us in the room, I would imagine, are not going to murder somebody in our life. Hopefully not. You may have thought about it, right? All it takes is one good drive into traffic into Houston, and you might have thought it, right? But the reality is most of us in this room are not going to struggle with that. We're not going to have those thoughts of, I'm going to actually murder someone. We may be frustrated, but we're not going to have those kinds of thoughts. But we kind of dismiss those things. And so we say things like, well, I'm not going to murder somebody. And I'm not living in adultery, and so I don't struggle with those things, and so I don't really need to pay attention to those. But Jesus, as he goes throughout the rest of this sermon, he pushes deeper and he says, hold on a second. I want you to listen to the heart behind the law that you have been given. And he says, not only should you not murder, but you shouldn't even be angry with your brother. I heard it said this way, is that Jesus is concerned with both murder and murderous attitudes. Because God doesn't just judge based off of our actions, he judges based off the intent of our hearts. That's a scary thought, isn't it? Think about the thoughts that you have in your mind, the thoughts that you've entertained throughout your life, that you could be judged on those if you don't have the grace of God in your life. Jesus says, I want you to see the intent of the law, the heart of the law. There's this ladder of actions and consequences that Jesus lays out here. Angry with your brother, insulting your brother, then calling your brother a fool. And we're going to kind of work our way through this ladder for some time today. Verse 22, let's look there again. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. We'll stop there. Anger, it's this emotion that kind of comes out of nowhere. There may be some triggers that you have that anger comes from. There's this reel or this meme that kind of goes around. It's like, you ever pack the car for vacation together as a couple? You ever done that? How'd that go? Not very good, is it? Right? Because everybody has their thing that they want to do, and it's got to be perfect, and you're play Tetris, and by the time you get in the car and everybody's quiet and you're just like, holding the steering wheel, driving down the road, like, right? You remember that? You know that feeling? Like, that there may be different triggers that you have that bring up that emotion of anger, but it's something that comes on out of nowhere. Researchers say that once someone becomes angry, that it can take up to 20 minutes for that person's brain to start using the thinking side of their brain, the cerebral cortex, not vortex, maybe it's a vortex, but the cortex. To start using that part of the brain, it takes 20 minutes sometimes for people to calm down off of their anger. That's why when somebody's angry, what never works is like, hey, could you calm down? It doesn't work, right? It just doesn't operate that way. The Stoics used to call anger a brief insanity. A brief insanity. And all throughout scriptures, there's these warnings against anger and the damage it can do. And so we need to pay close attention to what the Bible says about anger. We have to hold and lean into that. But what he's saying here is that this is more about staying mad, that we might hold a grudge, like that everyone who is angry or holding a grudge with his brother will be liable to judgment. That is not to say that regular anger is okay, and Jesus is not condoning regular anger as an acceptable behavior. But what he is condemning here mostly is carried anger, one that walks around with an attitude, when it walks around with this grudge against other people, and maybe even somebody that has a grudge against somebody of a different race or different political party, or maybe somebody that that has upset you, that you just walk around and you hold on to that anger because of what has happened to you. An example of that why anger in itself is not just sinful. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Be angry and do not sin." It is not the emotion of anger that is the sin. It's what we do in our anger that becomes a sin, right? And so paying attention, that doesn't mean that we walk around angry all the time. That doesn't mean that we walk around short-tempered. But it's not a sin to be angry. But he's saying, don't sin in your anger. Don't do it beyond that. Jesus is getting at the heart. It's about what happens after the anger hits. And it's a question of, what are we going to do with our anger? Are we going to prolong it? Or are we going to master it? Are we going to prolong our anger in our lives where we walk around holding this grudge against other people that have hurt us and done something to us? Or are we going to learn to master our anger? I can promise you that I am not at the mastering part yet. And I'm sure with many others in the room today that we have work to do. But there's this attitude that permeates our culture that says, I'll be nice to you until you cross me. I'll be nice to you, and I'll treat you as a good human being as long as you take care of me and you treat me nice. But once you cross me, you might even see people say, you're gonna get the real me. There's this attitude that permeates our culture of I'm good as long as you're good with me, but if you're not good with me, then we're gonna duke it out here. Then it's on. But Jesus calls us to do better, and he says, don't walk around with anger. Don't walk around holding a grudge. And then he goes on and he talks about insulting your brother. Whoever insults your brother will be liable to the council. The NIV version of this, the word is raka, which means more than likely, we don't know the exact word, but more than likely means stupid. Like the word that you would tell your kids in your house, don't say that word. It means stupid. Like in this, and not in the loose sense that we say today. Like in our culture, we kind of, everything is stupid that we don't like, right? It's like, well, that's stupid. I don't like it. That doesn't make that. Just because we don't like something doesn't make it stupid, does it? But that's what we walk around with. We walk around with that attitude. But rather, it's a question of the mental fitness of the other person. It's a word of contempt. The implication here is that if we walk around holding anger in our lives, eventually our mouth is going to speak what our heart has been harboring. I want you to hear that for a moment. If we walk around holding anger, eventually our mouth is going to speak what our heart has been harboring. How many's ever said something and as soon as you said it, it's like, I didn't mean to say that. What we should say is that that's been in my heart and I've been holding on to that and I should have confessed it earlier. But instead, we want to try to clean it up and it's like, well, I didn't mean to say that. It's another example that the commands of God are not just for control, as many would see them, but instead they are to protect us. Because our actions have consequences. And Jesus says this kind of undealt anger will leave you liable to damage in your life. And what the language that Jesus uses here is that you'll be liable to the council. Now, in our time today, the word council, it doesn't really make sense to us. But in Jesus' time, the first century Jews, they were talking about the Sanhedrin, which is made up of priests and scribes and elders of the Jewish law, and they would rule on the laws, kind of the Supreme Court of the Jewish people, the highest legal authority, and to rule the people of God and give civil direction to the people. And while we may not be liable to the council, Jesus certainly does not let us off the hook, because as kingdom people, ultimately, each one of us are going to be liable and held accountable for the words that we speak to God alone. And I don't know about you, but when I hear that phrase, that I'm going to be accountable to the Lord for my words, that scares me. Because It's not even just the words that we speak. I believe that it's even the words that we think and we meditate on. Reality is that for most of us, we like even what we speak, we might even say things like, "Well, I didn't say it," but thinking it sometimes is even worse than saying it. Jesus goes on to say, says, "Whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire." Remember, we're working away at this ladder. It was, you insult your brother. You're angry with your brother, you insult your brother, and now you call your brother a fool. There's this ladder of action and consequences, and now we're at the top rung of the ladder. This Greek word for fool is moros, which is where we get the word moron from. How many's ever been driving down the road and in traffic and somebody does something you don't like and you might say a word like that to them? You might say like, you're a moron. You're stupid, like all the things that we might say when we're in traffic and you're frustrated because somebody doesn't know how to merge. Somebody doesn't know how to put their turn signal on and you've been waiting and it's like, come on. This word moron or fool. It's not just calling someone a moron because they did something you don't like. It's deeper than that. This word is used throughout the Gospel of Matthew, and its main reference is those outside of the kingdom of God. And meaning this is that calling a Christ follower a moron or a fool was essentially calling him unsaved and relegating that person to hell. Now, we might say in our world, in our culture, like, I hope that person, like we hear this phrase whenever somebody does something awful in our world, right? They go to prison, they go to a judge, they go to prison, and we say, I hope they rot in hell. We've said that before. We've seen that said before. And a person that would use that kind of language has to be someone that is seething or soaking in anger. Someone that is walking around with it. At any moment, anger is going to burst out from around them. That's just it's their first response to everything. And Jesus says, we shouldn't be walking around calling people fools, saying like, you're not even a Christ follower. You're not even saved. You're not even... Just so full of anger and bitterness. Now, this word hell in this passage, it's the word Gehenna in Greek, which in Hebrew means Hinnom. And Jesus was hinting at something here. The valley of Hinnom, which is in Jerusalem still today. If you were to walk around Jerusalem, they would probably drive you on a bus past it. There's not really much there. It's just kind of this valley from the mount of... where the city of Jerusalem is. There's mountain valley on the other side. And this valley is where King Ahaz and King Manasseh offered child sacrifices to pagan gods. Over time, this valley became a place where they would dispose of dead bodies. It became a place where they would make child sacrifice. They would burn dead corpses in this valley. It was a place known of like, this is a place of death and fire and torment and just the most disgusting thing that you could imagine. That's what the valley of Hinnom was. It became this visual representation of hell and death and torment. And Jesus, as he's saying this, it would have been a shock to the ears of his listeners as they knew exactly what Jesus was talking about, that you are liable to the hell of fire if you keep going around calling people fools, that they're not saved, using your anger and taking it out on other believers. As Jesus often does, he brings this power, these words to power, and reminds his followers that the standard by which we live as Christ followers is a different standard than what the world holds to. And we have to remember ourselves that as we say it at the end of our service every Sunday, that as everyday followers, we go into our world to live out as everyday missionaries into our communities, into our workplaces, into the places that God has called us to go into. And Jesus says, don't walk around holding on to anger. Don't walk around holding on to all those things. It's not worth it. It's a protection that Jesus is giving us here. Verse 23. It says, so if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift to the altar. And so, as this transition in verse 23 says, so it's this transition from the previous passages to now, and it's connecting this idea of anger and bitterness and begrudging that we hold on to. He's saying that if you go to the altar and you have this anger and you have this undealt with sin, that you have not been reconciled to your brothers, you need to go be reconciled before you worship, before you do anything else. This verse should show us how important reconciliation is to Jesus, how important it is to his kingdom. Notice that it doesn't say that if your brother has something big against you, if your brother has something large to hold against you, that's not what he says. He says anything or something against you. And I point that out because many times what we end up doing in our lives is we minimize the pain of others, and we justify the pain that we've caused others by saying, it's not that big of a deal. All the while, this person that we have hurt is living off to the side with this big weight that they feel like they can't get rid of. And God says, I want you to stop everything that you're doing, and I want you to go be reconciled to that person. Chances are, the longer that we live this life of following Jesus, we're going to upset someone or we're going to offend them, because the reality is that we are broken human beings with a sinful nature that until Christ comes back and his kingdom is fully here, we're going to wrestle with that tension continually. But Jesus calls us to be reconciled to other believers even before we come to worship. And this is so heavy here. Pastor Charles Quarles says this, is that what we are before God involves how we are related to others. When we come before God, before a holy God, how we come before him involves how we relate to those around us. This is why Christianity was never meant to be lived alone. It's not a private religion. That's not what it is at all. It's to be done in community together and shaping each other and molding each other and realizing, you know what, I offended this person and I need to go back and make that right. I hurt this person by words that I said. I hurt this person with my actions. I need to go make it right. The idea behind this passage is that if we don't seek reconciliation with the people that we have hurt, then our worship is in vain. I think of the prophet Amos when he says that I despise your festivals. You get so caught up in just the normal everyday doing stuff for the Lord that we forget that we sometimes are approaching God flippantly. We approach him flippantly rather than how he calls us to come. I want you to think about the first century Jews for a moment who were still under the sacrificial system at this time. And how they would have to prepare themselves. They would go to the temple. They would bathe themselves. They would put on new clothes. They would get their animal ready for worship, for sacrifice. They would walk to the Temple Mount, and they would come to the altar ready and prepared, all those things. And the Lord says, even through all of that and all the preparation, the pilgrimage that you made and all the walking and all the lagging your family around and getting to the temple, if you remember in that moment that you have something against your brother, I want you to leave it there. I want you to go back to where your conflict is, and I want you to find reconciliation. I think about people that traveled quite a bit to get to the temple. They traveled days, weeks at times to get to the temple. And it's so important to God that he says, I want you to leave your altar, leave your sacrifice at the altar, and I want you to go be reconciled. Verse 25. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard, and you may be put in prison. And truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. This one can feel a little bit similar to the previous one, but the previous one is more spiritual, right? Like be reconciled to your brother before you go to the Lord. This one's more civil. This is the Lord, like, this is why he's all-encompassing, right? He's saying, I want to protect you even in your civil life. This is about an issue that we get so bad that lawyers and courts need to be involved, because much of what happened in the first century is rich people would take advantage of the poor people. And they would take them to court because they knew that they couldn't afford to do what they needed to do. They couldn't get right representation. They knew that they were at disadvantage. And so they would take them to court. The poor people go to prison. And once somebody goes to prison, that person's family is now liable for the debt that the person in prison has. And if their family doesn't have it, then their closest friends are liable for it. And Jesus says, no, the way of the kingdom is to treat others with kindness and with mercy, that we need to run to reconciliation before it even gets to the courts. And here's the challenge for us, Romans chapter 12, verse 18, where it comes in for us. He says this, if at all possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. It's a very key verse, if possible, as far as it depends on you, on me. Live peaceably with all. This verse is really supports the meaning behind Jesus' words here, is that we as followers of Jesus, that we are called to be peacemakers. As Brian talked about in the Beatitudes, that we are called to run and make peace, not just keep the peace, but to make the peace. And that we are to run into the conflict that is surrounding us and to make the peace and to not let it go on. John Piper had a good way of viewing it in the context of these two verses with two observations. The first was this, is that we are only responsible for what others hold against us when it is owing to real sin or blundering on our part. Meaning that sometimes we're going to offend somebody and we don't know that we offend them, right? Like that's going to happen at times. But if we do something sinful and we're hurtful with our words or with our actions, and we turn or we do something that causes our friend or our brother or sister in Christ to be upset, then yeah, we are responsible for that. And then two, he says that we are responsible to pursue reconciliation, to pursue it, but live with the pain if it does not exceed. If it does not succeed. In other words, is that we are not responsible to make reconciliation happen, but to pursue it. Meaning this, is that you may have hurt somebody in your life, and you pursue reconciliation with them, but they don't want to be reconciled. And we have to live with that pain. We have to live with that hurt because of our actions, because of what we've done. And so we have to live with that, but we are to continually pursue that reconciliation. Like, I want to be right with people before I go before God who has made me right with him. With this last one specifically, what we see is that the longer that we wait for reconciliation, the bigger the headache that the issue is going to be. Charles Spurgeon said it this way: a lean settlement is better than a fat lawsuit. So make peace with the utmost promptitude. A lean settlement is better than a fat lawsuit. I love that. The heart behind all these illustrations that Jesus gives is that the people of God are called to live reconciled to each other. Reconciled with other believers. But what we get so comfortable in our culture doing is we go to church, we get involved in church, somebody hurts us, we never reconcile, we go to the next church. We live in that community for a while, we get hurt, we go to another church because we don't reconcile. And we end up going from church to church to church, not reconciling, not doing the things that God has called us to do, that Jesus is calling us to do in this passage. And then we blame it on the church. And then we say, well, we've got church hurt. And I'm not diminishing church hurt. Church hurt is real. I totally get that. And I understand that sometimes things can happen in the church world that are painful. Some of you that have walked through a pastor and their moral failures, that's hurtful, right? You put your trust in them, and there's pain and there's bitterness and all those things. There is real church hurt. I'm not saying that there's not. But Jesus calls us, like, you're to be reconciled, to pursue it, to radically pursue reconciliation. And you need to go, instead of going from church to church, you need to start going to the people that have hurt you or that you have hurt, and you just start being reconciled to them before you even come to worship. The people of God are called to live reconciled to each other as we have been reconciled to Christ. As we have been forgiven, we should forgive. As we have been made right with God, we need to make it right with each other. Jesus is calling us to do something that may not be easy. And I understand that. And I'm up here on the stage with a microphone and I make it sound like it's easy, that you just need to forgive. You need to make it right. You need to reconcile. Like just go do it. Like it's like you don't have to think about it. I get that. I understand that I'm making it sound easy and it's not. But here's the thing, is that Jesus is continually modeling that for you and I. That he reconciled us to God. We didn't deserve it. Just as somebody that hurt you doesn't deserve reconciliation. But we give it because it's been given to us. Jesus directs us to live with inward composure and outward peace.